How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to another Roblox Studio tutorial video. I know it's been a while since I last uploaded, but that's okay because we're back today with another video. This one is going to be Roblox Physics and Constraints. And for this subject, we're going to be splitting it up into two videos for the sake of the length of the videos, because there's just so much content to cover, and in each constraint there's a bunch of stuff you can work with. So I want to make sure I cover all of that for you guys. So today we're going to be going from ball and socket all the way to no collision and everything in between there. And then for part 2 we'd be going from align orientation and to angular velocity and everything in between there. So that's just a heads up. So if you guys want to learn all about all constraints, I recommend you watch both of these videos. But maybe you find what you need in here, or maybe it might be better that I upload separate videos for each one in the future. That might be plausible, but for now we're just going to have part 1 and part 2 of physics and constraints in Studio. Now the first thing we're going to want to know is how to navigate and find our constraints list and where we can work with them. The first thing we're going to do is go to the model tab up here, click that, hover over to the right, and you'll find your constraints list and everything you can work with regarding constraints. So we have the constraints list itself. You can click the drop down and open and find all the constraints you can work with. You have show welds, constraint details, and draw on top. If you hover over them, they will give you a basic description of what they do, and I'll give you guys a basic description of what they do. The draw on top does a draw constraints on top of parts. The constraint details one just simply shows all the constraint details and constraints that you apply to a part. If you turn this off, it won't show. Same thing with show welds, except it's exclusively for welds, since welds draw lines across many parts, and it can be a big mess if you leave them on. And the final option you have here is the scale box, and you can change the scale of your constraints. So it takes your constraint details and sizes them up based on the scale that you have set. So if I had like scale 5000, the attachments would be giant and they might cover the entire game probably. Now one thing to know is that when you're playing and when you're testing, these constraints won't show, of course, because if they left that, then it would be a giant mess and games might not look great. So they disable that when you're testing. Now the first of the constraints that I'm going to go over is the attachment constraint, because this is probably one of the most important constraints out of all of them, as it's a host to all the other constraints you can work with. So I will also show you how to apply this attachment to the part, and as a side note, the way you apply these attachments and constraints will stay consistent with all other constraints, so it'll stay the same with how you put it on the part. And then after this, I'll just be showing you all the other ones. And as a reminder, what I'm going to be doing is showing you me working on the part and applying the constraint on it and changing it around and setting it up. And then I will be explaining what the constraint will be doing while I'm making it. So attachments are pretty much points that you can place on a part that will be apparent to or be used by many of the constraints in the constraint list, as I mentioned earlier. Another thing to know is that attachments can parent particle emitters, as I'm showing here, where the particles will actually emit from that point. It'll also parent lights, such as point lights, similarly shining the light from that point, and can even change the focal point of sound or audio when it's parented by that attachment. So to make this work, you have to insert one of those objects into the attachment itself. And something I've worked on recently, particularly, is using proximity prompts with them. You can honestly do quite a bit with attachments. Right now I'm just messing around here with the attachment to show you how the light moves with the attachment and how all the other things will move with the attachment. So just kind of playing around. And right there, I'm just changing if the attachment is visible or not. So this is going to be the ball and socket constraint, and this one is pretty simple. It'll allow both attachments on two parts for the ball socket, because there's going to be two attachments for it, and it's going to allow them to rotate freely about each of their axes, I don't know. So right here I was just setting up the ball and socket constraints on two separate models to show you how they work and react when they're actually in game and being tested. One thing you don't want to forget is to make sure they're unanchored so they will actually move. Here I'm going to be setting limits enabled on the constraint, and the purpose of limits enabled will stay consistent throughout most constraints in the constraint list, though it does change based on each constraint's functionality. What it does for ball and socket though is limit the angle at which the ball and socket can rotate on its axis, and here I set it to 30, so it's limited to reach at most a 30-degree angle. You can also change the restitution, which changes its elasticity. This changes how able it is to return to its normal position, and this is found in many other constraints. There's also twist limits, which I also enable. This will limit how much it can twist side to side, and this time it's going to be limited to turning 45 degrees maximum both ways. This one too can be found in other constraints. Next is the hinge constraint, and the hinge constraint allows attachments to rotate around a single axis specified by where you put it. The constraint also makes it so that the two attachments will occupy the same position and form a straight line for the part to rotate on. And no matter where you put the part, it will move to align the hinge constraint. Hinges can also be used for rotation by applying an actuator type where you can set it to motor or servo. With motor, the hinge can rotate the attachments continually, which can allow you to create movement or velocity like in a car, or in this case on the door, it would swing the door like crazy, go everywhere. And with servo, the hinge can rotate to a precise and specified angle, like with the property target angle if you set it to one. Both of these can have its overall speeds changed and have set limits on how fast it can move, ones like max torque. You can also find the actuator type property in many of the constraints that we're going to be going over, and the functionality for the motor and servo will stay relatively similar or the same throughout many of the constraints. The hinge constraint also has limits enabled, and this will limit the angle at which the attachment can turn, similar to the other one that I just explained, and in this case we have it set to 45 and negative 45. So it would be able to turn negative 45 degrees and also the other way 45 degrees. Here I'm just messing around with some custom physical properties of the part to see if I can make the door turn faster, since it seemed to be acting a little bit slow, and you could see that it was slower earlier in the video. Now here it's the same thing on a different axis, so it's just going to rotate the door or swing it a different direction or a different way. And then we have the Prismatic Constraint, and this one will allow a part to slide along one axis specified by the 2 attachments on the 2 parts when you place the constraint first, though it will not rotate like the cylindrical constraint if you already know about that one. And of course, there's also limits enabled on this in the properties. This time you can adjust the upper and lower position limits of the attachment 1, and it will mark a point on the line for showing the limits where the part will travel, as long as you have constraint details on. It'll mark like a little cylinder, and it'll mark where it'll stop in each part of the line. You can also change its actuator type, and those of course being motor and servo. Same thing with the motor, where it can apply a velocity and movement, and you can change the constant velocity of it and set limits such as max force applied to it. And with servo, you can give the part an offset based on the target position you input for it, and you can change the speed and force applied to the part when reaching that position as well, so changing how fast you get to that point. And of course here I'm testing the constraint, moving the part along the line that the attachment's created, and I'm using limits enabled with it, and I'm showing you how those limits are working by pushing the part through the uncollidable part and making it reach that limit, and then pushing it the other way as well to make it reach that limit. Though I didn't do anything with the motor or servo, so you're gonna have to play around with that yourself. After that is the cylindrical constraint, and it is nearly the same, sliding along one axis, except this time it'll actually rotate or spin. All the settings explained in the prismatic constraint apply to this one as well, and I even use the same properties. But in this case, because this constraint is cylindrical, there are more options to manipulate and change how it spins or rotates. In this case, you can apply something like the angular limit, which of course will limit the angle at which it can spin or rotate. You can also add an inclination angle, which will help determine the direction the rotation axis goes, and even an angular actuator, which will apply the same functions as the motor and servo, but adjust precisely the rotation and spins applied to the part. And here once again I'm just testing the limits applied to the part and seeing how it spins and functions overall, so you can also get an idea. Next we have the rope constraint, and the rope constraint is a loose separation constraint that will separate 2 attachments to a specified length, but won't go any longer unless you actually change the properties of the rope. And the rope will freely move around if it's swinging, where it can also contract and move together while it's swinging. Like if it were to bounce or something, it'll kind of fold. Here I'm just messing around with its length and other properties of it that you can too. The rod constraint is very similar, though it's not loose and it stays at the same length forever, and this is because it's solid. It will not become shorter or longer or fold or contract, but it does freely move similar to the rope. Now one thing the rod constraint actually does have compared to the rope is limits enabled, so you can actually limit the angle at which the rod is able to swing, so you limit how far it can swing. The spring constraint applies forces to its attachments based on its lengths, stiffness, and damping. The force and reaction of the spring will change based on the distance of the placement for each attachment. If the spring's attachment's length or distance stretches out too long, particularly if it's longer than the free length property that's set, it'll come back together or compress. If the spring's attachments are too close together, they will push apart or expand. Once again, we have some properties, and specifically there is a limits enabled property that allows you to determine the maximum length it can achieve, as well as the minimum. There's also damping, which reduces or lowers the amount of energy produced by the spring. The free length property determines the length of the spring between both of the attachments when it's not doing anything. And finally, stiffness will determine how well the spring will freely move. A low value of stiffness will allow it to move less freely, but a high value will allow it to move a ton, as you can see in the example. I also made some cool little car examples to show you the different methods of using springs in a car, or with wheels I guess, or maybe as suspension. So the one on the left is more for like suspension, so you fly off a cliff and the springs will expand and then you land and it'll contract. And the other ones, the wheels will kind of like bounce side to side. The next one is the weld constraint, and this one will hold any and all parts together when a weld is applied between one part and at least one other, or many other parts. And that also means you do not have to anchor any of the parts in those welds, otherwise it really wouldn't work. They don't even have to be touching and the weld will work. One part must be anchored if you want the entire weld to be grounded though, but don't anchor anything if you want your welds to freely move. You can also enable or disable the weld constraint, but I wouldn't advise doing that unless you're doing something with a program or you're scripting something. And finally we have the NoCollision Constraint, and this will basically serve to allow specified parts to move through the part it's assigned, a part that would otherwise be collidable or solid for every other part or person. This will only work with the part or parts it's constrained to though. This means that you will not be able to walk through, but the part can go through. If you want to have it so you can walk through as well, you can disable the can collide property of the part. Similar to the weld, how I just explained, you can also decide if it's enabled or disabled. Alright guys, so that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this studio tutorial on physics. This one took a while, and you could see because my outfits were changing throughout the video quite a bit. I hope this was very helpful and you learned something new today. I hope you brought something new into your brain. You learned something today. If so, that's great. If you did learn something new and you did enjoy it, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. Leave a comment for what you want to see from me, what you want to see in a tutorial, maybe what you want me to build. Any ideas, I could appreciate that. And I guess I'll see you guys in the next one. And specifically, it'll be the next physics video. We'll be going over stuff like this, the last of the constraints in the constraint list. I saw the length of this video and it was literally 20 minutes, and I was thinking if I did the full constraint list, I was like, man, it might have reached 50 minutes. So I'm glad we split this up into 2 videos. There's also one more thing I want to mention. There's a brand new United States 11 or US 11 community Discord that is up right now that you can join. We're going to be hosting events there. We're going to be doing like group things. You can post your creations, you can socialize with other people, and we got a bunch of other stuff coming along the way. I have some plans that I've been working on. I've been working on some games for it, coming up with new ideas for the events. You'll see, just join that Discord. It'll be in the description below. Of course, that's only if you're able to, but that's going to do it. And I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya.